It always takes a little second to do that. So welcome. I think we are live on YouTube, or no, not quite yet. So yes, welcome to Clear Vision Wednesday. I am your host, Claudia Mühlenweg. I am the creator of the Natural Clear Vision Method and the Natural Clear Vision Institute. And every week we're going live, or I'm going live here. And many of those Wednesdays are with a guest speaker, with an expert highlighting an aspect that is connected to our vision that we might never think about. And today is no exception. Today, our topic is the connection between vision and voice. So educating us on vision, on voice, and what we can do to maybe improve our voice. So welcome, Christine Katzenmeier is my guest today. Welcome, Christine.
Hi, Claudia. I'm so excited to be here today. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so first of all, we are friends. We actually met, that's a longer story, but you are a speech pathologist, you are a trained opera singer, you are, let me see, all the things, you basically are a voice coach. So you've really been immersed in that whole business of voice. So I have two questions before we even get into the juicy content. I noticed you're wearing a headset. Tell us about that.
So this is not so I can hear better. This is actually intentional because it helps you preserve your vocal demand. When we have a headset on, the mic is right here, and then perceptually the brain is thinking, oh, we don't have to talk as loud because the mic picks it up right here. Versus if you take it off and talk on speaker, we tend to talk a little louder because now we're on speaker. The microphone picks it up the same way, but perceptually we feel like, oh, we're talking on the computer, so I need to talk louder. So this is number one recommendation I tell people that do a lot of talking, especially on Zoom, have a lot of meetings, use a headset because it reduces your vocal load. So that's why I'm using a headset. Yes.
So it makes your voice softer and less strain, less effort. So, and the other thing, well, before we get into that, I wanted to also ask you, like, this is what I do with all my guests, like, how did you get into this voice coaching, speech pathology? How did you end up doing this? Tell us a little bit.
I kind of fell into that. So my passion was always singing. I wanted to become a main stage opera singer. I had my first voice lesson when I was 18, so I started fairly late with that. But I was like, yeah, come on, I take a couple voice lessons. How big of a deal can it be? And then I had my first voice and I'm like, wow, there is a lot involved in that. And I just loved it. And then I became, fast forward 12 years, I became an opera singer, did a lot of performances, and I started getting into coaching as well, started teaching singing. And then I realized, how come some people have a shorter range? How come some people have a hoarse voice? What's up with that? And I just felt, even though with all the training that I'd had, I couldn't fully provide what some people needed. I just felt like there was this missing piece to it. And then a friend of mine introduced me about speech pathology. Didn't even know that field existed at that time, with an emphasis in voice. And I'm like, that's what I need. And so I went back to school, got a master's in communications with a specialty in voice. And so that really added another component to the overall understanding of the voice. And that has just transformed so many things in my own life and also with my clients. Because I have the performance background, I work with a lot of singers, but also speakers. And then also having not just the performance aspect, but also really understanding how the voice works. And, I can now speed it up for people a lot quicker than all the training and experiences that I went through. So it's really nice how that picture came together.
Yeah, that is really amazing. So, I'm curious, is there a misconception or about voice like it is with vision? With vision, there's so many misconceptions that I educate on, but is there something about voice that people think is true that is a complete myth or not true?
Absolutely. So the number one thing people think, they're just going to have to live with the voice that they have. Some people, they have voice problems, right? They have a hoarse voice or a scratchy voice. Some people, they just don't like the tone of their voice and they feel like they were born with it. That's just how it is. They can't change it. You actually can change the voice just because how the voice is built, and we'll talk about how the voice works and all that to get a better understanding why it's actually easy to change the way you sound, and it's totally possible. And so the hopes is also to just shed some light on that, because it makes me really sad when people come to me. They're like, they have a lot of problems, and some of them, they just want to improve their performance. But it's just to see that there's no need to struggle like that because you can change it fairly quickly. Just like with vision, what you teach people, it's fantastic because you think, oh, with age, the vision goes down. It's just a natural decline. It doesn't have to be that way. Same for the voice.
That is so good to know because the first time I ever heard my own voice, that was a long time ago. In school, we had to record, I don't even know what it was, but we had to record something back and then on a cassette tape. And the first time I heard my own voice, I was like, oh my God, that is horrible. Like, I did not like my own voice. And I think that goes for a lot of us. But that's beside the point. So obviously there is people that have a very high, like a Mickey Mouse voice. And there's some people that have that scratchy voice or some. So you're basically telling us that we can change. So tell us a little bit more, what can we actually change when it comes to our voice?
So let's group it up a little bit. Let's talk about the quality of voice. So for example, right now I talk a little breathy and I sound very different. Or now I'm talking in glottal fry. Okay, all of a sudden you can still understand me, but I sound different and you probably perceive me differently. Okay, so now I'm talking more in a high-pitched voice. Okay, again, you can understand me, but you probably perceive me differently. Or then I sound like this, you can understand me, but it's very different, right? Or then I have a really pressed voice. Okay, so you can understand me, but and I'm not trying to create character voices here. These are just examples of how a voice can sound like. And for example, if somebody has a hoarse voice, that usually has to do with swelling of the vocal folds. And that usually happens with overuse of the voice, like if there's a strain when you use your voice, the way you're talking. Some people then end up with a pathology where they have nodules on their vocal folds or a cyst or a polyp, and that comes from overuse of the voice. So when people, discover that they have a pathology on their vocal folds, nodules, for example, they're like, okay, do I need surgery? Well, sometimes surgery is a solution, but it's not always the first step. And that's also a step we want to avoid. And then realizing, oh, you can actually retrain how you use your voice, because how did it get there in the first place? And it's about how you use your voice.
Okay, that is fascinating. We will talk more about all of these things. So, but basically, the message here is you can change your voice, just like you can make your voice probably a little deeper or richer or fuller or so let's talk about all these things. So what is, like, how does voice actually work? Can you kind of walk us a little bit through the anatomy of talking and speaking?
Happy to, yes. Okay. So we have vocal folds that sit inside the voice box, which is the larynx, right? It's right inside the throat. And they're basically two bands of tissue. They're just a little longer than a centimeter. And as they open, they're the gateway into the lungs where we take a breath in. When they close, they vibrate, and that's when we start sound. And that goes for speaking and singing. In fact, I have a little model here if you want to take a look. So this is a big version of it. So this is the larynx, right? And this is the hyoid bone. It basically sits like this inside our throat, yeah? And then if I tilt this over, do you see those white little bands inside there? Can you see that? Yeah. Yep. So these are basically the vocal folds. And again, their function is to open and close. They open to take a breath in, and then they close and they start the vibratory cycle to get the voice going. What gets them going is breathing. So as the air passes the vocal folds, that's when we start making sound. When they don't go all the way together, then it can sound a little breathy, for example, right? Or if I really press them hard, this is what happens to them. And the other part that's involved in voice production, that's where the sound originates, but then it's the mouth and the nasal cavity where the sound resonates in, which is how I can modify how the voice sounds. So for example, I can make it more nasal. I can make it higher pitched. I can bring it lower. I can talk more throaty. I can talk more forward. So now I'm accessing the resonating space, which is why you're able to change the voice fairly quickly. If there's too much effort in the throat, the muscles involved in producing the vocal fold vibration, they get more fatigued, and that's when that again changes the quality of the voice. So breathing is another element, and then posture. Just like breathing and posture is very important for vision as well.
So I want to get to, you said so much good stuff. So first of all, you talked about that strain, that efforting, like, pushing a lot. So it sounds like because a lot of times, let me backtrack to vision. A lot of times people think it's just the eye muscles are too weak. Like we need to strengthen the muscles. And it sounds like with voice, it's kind of similar. They're not necessarily too weak. It's more like you're making way too much of an effort. So it's more about relaxing and improving the breath. Is that correct? Does that make sense?
Correct. So basically, the reason why I showed you how the vocal folds work with the airflow that passes through, if there's not sufficient breath support, what that means, if breathing is not abdominal, or some people, they hold their breath while talking, that means the airflow is not sufficient, but then the muscles around the vocal folds in the larynx, they need to activate more to keep that vibration going. And that's very often where fatigue comes from, or then a strained voice comes from. So it's a balance of, the breath support. And again, with more relaxed breathing, we're more likely to access abdominal breathing versus having high breathing into the shoulders. That creates then, more tension in the neck area.
That is so connected to vision. It's the same exact thing.
I love it. Exactly, yes.
For a different reason, I talk about the oxygen in the breath, and if we don't get enough oxygenation in the brain, then obviously that affects. But the vocal cords are directly really even more impacted by the breath. So if you're not breathing properly, that vibration is strained and that affects your voice. That is so fascinating. So what are some, so you touched on posture. So tell us a little bit about posture.
So posture, the tendency is like we're leaning in because we want to convey a message and move forward. What it actually does, it lifts up the larynx and then the muscles are stretched more, and that adds to more strain versus just being in a more natural posture. Like when we're sitting, we're slouching forward, right? We don't really have room for the diaphragm to fully expand and lower. So with that, breathing gets more shallow. And again, we want to have sufficient air supply into the lungs for them to fill. And so we have that natural support from the diaphragmatic breath. So posture, for one, has to do with breathing. Again, if we're slouching forward, right, we don't access the breathing optimally. But then also posture, head posture, in terms of, moving the head forward, that adds more strain in the neck area. And because the muscles, the extrinsic muscles of the larynx, are directly connected to the voice box and how we produce sound.
Okay, well, that makes total sense, because I see that goes hand in hand with vision problems a lot of times, especially when someone is nearsighted, or by even farsighted, there's a kind of sense of grabbing things, like trying to coming toward the screen. So then you have that forward head posture, or craning the head forward. So that actually also affects your voice basically as negatively as it does your vision. So that's so interesting. I didn't know that. I'm learning so much here today. Tell us a little bit about what you mentioned, a bunch of different voice problems, but are there other things? Obviously, we know like a lisp, right? Or that's probably the most common one that I can think of right now. But what are other voice problems that people have and that can be completely reversed or improved?
It's interesting you mentioned the lisp, because a lisp is actually articulation related, but affects overall intelligibility. So if I talk like this, right, because the tongue basically pushes between the teeth on the S sound, and that's what causes the lisp. So I'm exaggerating right now, but that's what a lisp is, right? All of a sudden, I don't sound as clear anymore. Another component, so now I talk differently. Any idea what I'm doing right now?
So clenching your teeth?
Yeah, so I'm not opening my jaw. So sometimes the quality of, but that again, that affected the quality of my sound, but also articulation, because the tongue is the main articulator. So if we don't give it enough space, it's not going to be as clear. Plus, I talked about resonating space earlier. So if my mouth is more closed, I'm not going to be able to produce more sound. And especially when it comes to projecting sound, to get louder, I can easily do that by just opening up this space in the mouth more. Whereas I'm trying to talk louder now and pushing from the throat. So in terms of articulation, again, if the jaw is clenched, that affects the clarity. And then in terms of the tone of the voice, that has to do with subtext, basically, how we say something. Hi, how are you? Hi, how are you? So it has to do with the emotion that's attached on the tone that we're using, right? And then in terms of pitch, are we talking more at an elevated pitch, Are we talking more at a lower pitch? So that affects it as well. Also speed. How fast are we talking? So right now I can make a demonstration talk really fast. You can understand me. It's going to be harder to follow along, but I'm still talking. And I have to take a lot of breaths in order for me to continue this way. If I talk really slow, it's going to be very hard to follow along with me because I'm talking really slow. Another part that can affect voice and speech is inflection. And you and I, we share the same background. So American English, for example, has a lot more inflection. There's a lot more musicality with it, right? German language tends to be more flat. So if I talk more like this, as if it's more monotone, again, it makes a big difference on how we're being perceived. The speed that I'm talking might be okay, but there's not a lot of inflection going on. And so this is especially important if you are giving presentations, especially for salespeople. In order to engage your audience, inflection has to be there. And I don't know if you had that going back to Germany. Now they think of me as a foreigner, but only because I am now using with the American inflection when I speak German. I don't have a German accent, but I use the American English inflection because to me it has more tonality and it sounds friendlier versus sounding more like this.
I don't think I've thought about that. What I did notice, so and overall, Americans speak louder. It's whenever I'm in Germany, it's kind of interesting because I came back to Germany. People are like, don't talk so loud. I'm like, oh, I kind of adapted to that environment. So I don't know why that is, but there is a overall like louder talking. I have not really thought about the inflection so much, but that is super fascinating how the different languages affect that. You mentioned speakers, or you mentioned people that are selling things. Obviously, a lot of us here are, either speaking on stages or we are producing Instagram reels or YouTube videos. So what would you say is the biggest reason people come to see you or work with you outside of the pure speech pathologies? What are some things that you've worked with, or maybe you have some stories you can tell us how you work with somebody and what changed?
Absolutely. Different backgrounds. If a speaker comes to me, it's maybe because they can project maybe the clarity of their voice, you might perceive them as good speakers, but they want to up it to the next level. And what really comes down to that they don't have the confidence to actually do the presentation they want to do. They have fantastic content, but they're not convinced how they're sounding. So when they are able to transform their voice to the level that they really desire, it makes a huge impact in their overall performance, but also in their overall well-being. Another example would be I had one woman, she was a teacher, professional singer, and she had 2 kids. Now in her case, her voice was almost shot. She came to me, she could barely talk or sing anymore. She was devastated. She's like, I might have to give up my teaching job because I can't do it all. And so we started working together, and now she's singing regularly. She's telling her kids nighttime stories, and she happily teaches, and her voice is just lasting no matter what's going on, how long she's talking. So people come to me for different reasons. But the bottom line is, again, if there's something that people are not happy with their voice, they can change it. And it is so empowering for people to have those tools. Because once you have those tools, that's where the confidence comes from. Because if I tell you, Claudia, just speak more confidently at your next presentation, you're like, how do I do that?
Yeah, exactly.
But if you know what to do with your voice, what are some tools that you can implement? You're like, oh, okay. Because you're establishing a certain muscle memory, and then you can access that when you need it. And that's where the confidence comes from.
I'm definitely going to work with you and practice some things as I want to speak on bigger stages. But it's interesting because when it comes to vision, right, we have crutches like glasses, right? A lot of times people come to me when they have their first eye disease or their vision really declined. And I'm like, oh God, I wish he would have. I mean, not that we can't make changes. We can always make improvements, always. Right. However, sometimes I'm like, I wish he would have come sooner. So I feel like it's a similar thing with voice, right? That it's almost like you talked about that lady who would barely not talk anymore and might have lost her job or doesn't sing anymore. So what is something that people may be thinking is like, what is kind of a crutch? Is that like crutches, like for voice, where people think, oh, I'm just going to do this and then I'm going to be fine?
Absolutely. Just like I'm thinking with vision, it's probably, oh, I'll just pick up a pair of glasses and I'll be fine, right? With voices,
That's
here it
okay.
might be coming. Excuse me.
I know you have a little bit
With
of
voice,
a sore throat right now. So
yes, yes. So with voices, people think like just resting their voice or just drinking more tea will solve the problem. Now, these are great things. However, they're band-aid solutions. Do I recommend resting your voice at times? Absolutely. However, just resting your voice is not going to solve the problem because you're not addressing the root cause of it. Because why is your voice fatiguing in the first place? Why are you not happy with your voice? Why don't you feel confident about your voice? There's something about that you do with your voice that doesn't feel confident. And
okay.
yeah.
That makes sense. So basically, so resting your voice is a good thing. I think drinking tea or drinking fluids is important. However, the reason that, and this is actually interesting that you bring this up, because people always blame for vision, right? A lot of times I hear, oh, I'm on screens all day long. My eyes are so tired. And yes, are screens the best thing for your eyes? Not. It's probably like you said, talking all day is probably also not the best thing for the voice. However, you can still have amazing vision. Like we actually did a 3-day event last fall where we were on the screen like for 3 full days, participants 30 hours on the screen, and people improve their eyesight. So is that similar to voice? Like if you address the root cause and tell us what the root cause is, then talking more like that teacher, or what, like, when you talk a lot each day does not really fatigue your voice.
Absolutely. The first thing we talk about is identify the root cause of the problem. The next thing is eliminating triggers. Just those 2 steps alone makes a huge difference. Within a day or 2, you'll already notice a difference. So let's talk about hydration, for example, is a key element for the voice. So when they say I drink more tea, my first question is, what kind of tea are you drinking? How much tea are you drinking throughout the day? And then what else are you drinking? So I would have some people that come and say like, oh yeah, so I drink a cup of tea, it's herbal tea, and I drink 5 cups of coffee, and I drink a glass of water. Get the idea? See where I'm going with this?
Lots of caffeine.
So
No,
let's
no.
switch out the water with the coffee, or vice versa, right? And then keep your tea. But so you got to look at, again, the bigger picture and what does hydration really look like. I mentioned the vibratory cycle of the vocal folds earlier. There is the superficial lamina propria is the outside mucosa sheet of the vocal folds, and it needs to stay moist. So if the body is dehydrated at a systemic level, that impacts the vibratory cycle of the vocal folds, makes it harder for them to move. That means you're going to have to work harder. So just hydration alone is a key element in improving the voice.
Okay, hydration. What else?
Resting your voice when needed. So you don't, if there's ways you can avoid talking, instead of, you just got off a long conference call and then you call up your friend and tell them all about it, you can send an email or text instead, and really just make a conscious effort to not use your voice for a certain time. And then also sleep is important. Are you getting adequate sleep? Because again, the overall performance, if your body feels fatigued, breath support is going to be compromised, your voice is going to have to work harder.
That all makes total sense. We actually have a question on YouTube that I thought was really interesting.
Okay, yeah.
So Lana is asking, what do you suggest for stopping clearing the throat, to maybe do a nasal drip? That kind of thing that we do, like we call it.
It's a big one. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Throat clearing is a big one. Throat clearing comes because there's something either sitting on the vocal folds, or if it's become a habit, there's a neurosensory feedback loop that you're going to clear your throat even though nothing is there. The way you break it is by swallowing. So instead of trying to clear your throat, try and swallow instead. So take a sip of water or swallow instead. Sometimes you can't avoid clearing the throat. If that's the case, then try to do a softer clear versus like a really hard clear. Because again, the more you go ahead and rub your hands together. Do that for me, please. All right, and do it for a bit.
Okay.
And then tell me, what do you feel?
It's like warmth, it's energy, it's like there's
Yes. Would you do it for a long time?
no,
Right? Because
it just takes effort and it's like, yeah, I don't know. It doesn't
right.
no.
So the reason I had you do that is because when we clear our throat, this is what happens to the vocal folds. They're basically squished together and they're rubbed against each other. So the more we clear the throat, the less likely they want to do this. It makes them less happy. So if you can avoid clearing your throat, that's going to make a big difference.
Okay. Well noted. Well, thank you. That's good. That's really so Sun Moon on YouTube is asking, do you have to change the way you speak to be a good singer? I had a singing teacher that was trying to change my speaking voice, which I didn't like. I thought we should embrace who we are. What's your opinion?
That's a great question. So for singers, there's two things. It depends on the technique. Sometimes it can be the technique that you're using, and it depends on, does the voice go out in the upper register, mid register, or lower register, or is it across the board? Sometimes the speaking voice can affect the singing voice. So for example, if I talk in glottal fry, and again, I have no idea, what you sound like. So I'm not imitating anybody here. I'm just giving an example. So
Right.
for example, if I talk a lot like this in my like a throaty voice right now, and then I would try to say, oh, try to do some scales, my throat already starts in a lower position altogether. And it's possible then that that's carrying over into the singing aspect as well. Just like the singing voice can affect the speaking voice. And the fascinating thing with the voice is also, I want to do a little detour on this because I think it's a really important element. Because the voice sits inside of us, it's the instrument that sits inside of us, basically. This person had mentioned something about you feel you lose your identity, and that can very easily feel that way when you try to change your voice. Now,
Mhm.
let's say if I try to talk from talking like this to moving more forward, like the way I'm talking now, that might feel, because if you've always identified sounding like this, right, and all of a sudden you change it, wait, this is not me, I'm not used to that. So it takes a little time to process that. But again, it's not, you're not changing your identity, you're learning to adapt to a voice use that's just going to be a lot more suitable. Plus, it's going to allow you to have your singing range go up and down with ease, and that's really the goal. But it's learning to adapt and being comfortable with that. It's just like with the, again, because the voice sits inside of us and the vagus nerve is the cranial nerve that innervates the larynx. Now, the cranial nerve also wraps around the aorta, around the heart, and then it connects to the emotional compartment in the brain. So when we do feel emotional, it's going to be reflected in the voice. That's why how we feel about the voice and the identity of the voice, they're so closely connected in terms of the internal change that we make with the voice, but then also how we're being perceived. Because if I'm really frustrated right now and I'm trying to talk to you and I'm trying to talk friendly, well, you can still hear
Right.
she doesn't sound quite clear there, does she? Yeah.
That brings up so many overlap with vision because I mean I love that we're going into that deeper emotional piece and like how are we seeing ourselves, our identity, because how we see how we want to be seen or maybe not want to be seen. This is all really in the vagus nerve, obviously, in our nerves, the eyes, in the ears. So there's the viscera, everything. So there's obviously that component. And we know that we see better when we are relaxed. And it sounds like the speaking is also when we are relaxed.
Very much so.
Now, and I think at the end of the day, I had a coach once tell me, every time you open your mouth, you have a speaking engagement. And I thought, like, that's, instead of just blah, 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 and we chit-chatting all day and talking like lots of boring things, think about that every time you say something, just like when you look at something or when you blink or whatever, with all our expressions, you actually engaging, with yourself, or usually or other people, but there is think of it as something that the four agreements say be impeccable with your word, but I almost like the idea of being impeccable with our voice, because matching our voice to our emotions and maybe even using our voice to uplift us, right? I have all these thoughts as you were talking. I'm like, maybe there's a way to, color of the day is something I do with vision improvement. Like when you think, oh, I can't see everything is blurry, find a color and then notice how much of that color you see. And, you're kind of focusing on the good things, you're in the present moment. And it's almost like with voice, is there something that we can do to actually lift up our whole emotional
Yes.
state?
Yes,
Okay.
you can. And you know how you can do that? I find this so fascinating, but there's such close correlation between vision
Yeah.
and the voice. Humming. So for
Mm.
one, humming it helps with placement of the voice. I talked earlier, instead of talking from the throat, talking more forward. And you want to start from a feel-good sensation. So instead of going by, what do I sound like when I do this or when I do that, go by, how does it feel? So let's just, try it out for a moment. Think of something really pleasant, either a fragrant flower, in the garden, or like an ocean breeze, or anything that makes you go, or like your favorite meal.
Mm. And now I feel like very self-conscious.
And just let yourself, instead of worrying what it's going to sound like, just let yourself explore, like, oh,
Right.
feel good
Oh,
sensation.
yeah, it's good.
Yes. So that's something you can explore with. And there's also actually research shows that humming has also a wonderful benefit of having a dilating effect and enhancing nasal breathing
Okay. And
versus
it's
just quiet
calming,
nasal
right?
breathing. I'm sorry?
It's also calming, right? Because of
It's
the
calming. Correct. Yes.
om in yoga, when we do the om at the end of
Yes.
class. Yeah, okay.
And again, when you do it, just want to, instead of making it from the throat, make it a pleasant one. Just a feel good sensation starting from there.
Great place to start. I like that. Thinking of delicious food and I'm gonna eat soon. I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, and you know what? Just you by doing that, you change your whole facial expression.
Oh, wow. Okay. I will do that now. I will have like this. It's such an easy way, like how with vision, we often talk about just blink more, because blinking lubricates the eyes, it
Right,
prevents
right.
looking. It's like so that's an easy thing, guys. Listen, like just doing a little bit of that, just getting into that positive mindset. That's
Correct.
amazing.
And we talked earlier about, I just told you to feel confident when you talk, but how do you do that? But you just did this humming, your whole
Ah,
expression changed. Such an
simple,
easy thing
simple
to do.
stuff.
Yes, yes, yes.
So we have more good questions I would like
Okay.
to ask you. So Brigitte is asking, how does tinnitus influence my voice? I had tinnitus for over 20 years, where I'm wearing hearing aids, but at times of arguments, I raise my voice a lot. And I grew up in Germany too. Okay. So tinnitus, right? Like we call
The
it
ringing in
Hirschberg.
the ear. Yeah,
Yeah.
the ringing in the ear. So just to understand the question correctly, is it that as the voice gets louder, the tinnitus keeps going up?
So the question is really, how does tinnitus influence my voice? So basically having that ringing in the ears.
It can influence it in the sense of finding the comfortable pitch for you, because if you have a ringing tone, it could be that the ear wants to adapt. So when you're talking, it's almost like there's this dichotomy going on, because you have this ongoing sound happening while your voice is happening over here at the same time. So there can be an interference. So if there's a possibility to maybe focus on what the voice sounds like versus putting the focus on the ringing of the ear.
Okay.
Because as we put more focus on the ringing, and again, it's easier said than done, but if we put the focus on the ring, it's like in a meditation. When we put the focus on the background noise that's happening and we're fighting it, it's going to get louder. If we do a meditation and just like, okay, it's part of that's happening right now, I'm just letting it be there. It's kind of letting it be in the, back seat of the car versus being in the driver's seat.
So I do want to address the part of our question about the arguments, right? Raising the voice, which of course we've all done. I've raised two
Right.
dogs on my
Yes.
own, and I
Yes.
can
Yes.
attest to the raising my voice.
Mm-hmm.
So how, and this is getting a little bit off the exact topic of voice, but in a way, like raising the voice, right? It's like we trying to push. Again, it's about power and cutting through the noise, literally, right? Other techniques that we could use to cut through the noise that are voice related instead of raising our voice and straining, which we usually do, right? When we talk really loud, most
Correct.
people are. Yeah.
Yes. And I've worked with people where that, family dynamics or whatever is going on, where that then actually gets to a point where it affects the voice. So that's something I mentioned earlier about projecting the voice. If I use a more open approach, hi, how are you? I can make that a little aggressive, but it was open. When emotions come into play, again, the body tends to tighten up, and then there tends to be more pressure from the throat. Mm-hmm. The goal is to keep the voice more open and use breath support. I do this a lot of with actors that I work with, because in their scenes, they have very heated scenes,
right.
Whether that's voiceover actors, stage actors, film actors, same, right? And so we work on projecting the voice in a safe way. And it's totally doable because they have to be able to project and get into arguments, have heated conversations, and not strain their voice as they do it. So again, it's using more open approach, but then also connecting the breath with that to support that voice. And as you add more pressure, that's what actually gives it then more sound and more volume. Or like with singing, it's in order to cut through the audience, it's not about having to rely on a microphone. It's where the voice is placed, because then you create a certain amount of overtones, which then the sound waves travel out further. And that's what makes a voice cut through the audience.
Wow, it's so simple yet so complex at the same time.
Yes.
Very fascinating topic. So raising the voice or increasing the volume without the strain and the openness. So yeah, this is definitely something I feel like we could all use lessons. And let me see what other questions. So Mary Ann says, I radiated happiness when I hummed. Okay, well, thank you for the feedback, guys. I really appreciate it.
I agree. Yes.
Can you talk about tongue thrust?
Yes. So tongue thrust is basically when the tongue is sitting, instead of up the roof of the mouth, it's sitting on the floor of the mouth and it's pushing forward between the teeth. That can happen in childhood. There's some adults that still have it. And with a tongue thrust, that means when you swallow, for example, the tongue is pushing onto the teeth. It can also affect speech. So as I was demonstrating earlier, when there's a lisp, the tongue sits more forward. So all of a sudden, it's not as clear anymore. A tongue thrust can be caused if there's an airway issue. For example, if the back of the throat, if the tonsils are enlarged, if there's adenoids. So if there's a lot of mouth breathing, the tongue, so if this is the back of the throat, can you see it okay? And then if the tongue sits forward, if the tongue sits low, it's going to close the airway. Well, I got to do it this way. If it's up on the roof of the mouth, do you see how this gap just opened up here? That's basically the airway. So if the tongue sits low, it's closing the airway. If it's up on the roof of the mouth, it opens up that space. And a tongue thrust, that is something that you want to address. And I work with children and adults on that as well. And sometimes there's an overlap with voice as well. But what a tongue thrust does, basically, especially in terms of dental alignment, for example, if you've had braces or you need braces, very often there's an association with a tongue thrust because the tongue pushes forward, and then that affects how the teeth are aligned. And then it can cause orthodontic relapse as well, because again, the function of the tongue was not changed. The structure of the teeth was, but not how the tongue is moving and resting.
That is so fascinating. So yeah, a lot of people, that a lot of kids are getting braces. I just had a round of Invisalign because it was an uneven bite, and I did have always a lot of tension. So my jaw is one of those spots that tended to get tight. Like my stomach and my jaw were always my 2 points, and this is where I think everybody noticing where you tend to kind of tighten the muscles the most, because we all have different patterns, right? And so I'm very conscious about this now and kind of massaging these muscles, because as you said, when the jaw is tight, then we clench the teeth more, and that affects our voice. Many good points. I think we can talk for hours. There's a couple more questions. So Ed is asking on YouTube, are there voice practices or exercises to help my vision? and I don't know it since you're not a vision teacher, but I think all the relax exercises, but are there specific things that you recommend that could be particularly helpful?
I think we talked about the hydration because again, for the and then talk about blinking of the eye. I think palming, if you're familiar with palming, as your people do that, yes, that's super helpful for the voice also because for one, you do nasal breathing. That means the lips are closed, the mouth is staying moist, and so is the vocal folds. Relaxed breathing, it relaxes the body. You're more likely to access abdominal breathing. And with that, just with palming, that's a great benefit for the vision, but also for the voice.
And so when you talk about breathing, can you talk a little bit more about breathing? Because obviously we can only talk on exhales, right? When we inhale, right? I mean, at least I cannot talk on an inhale. So can you talk a little bit about how can we improve our voice? Like what is some simple breathing techniques maybe that you can give us or tell us a little bit about to do that abdominal breathing?
Absolutely. What I do recommend, first check in with your body. So place your hands on your abdomen as you're standing or sitting, right? And then just observe what happens when you take a breath in. What happens when you let the air out? And just do a couple breaths. We're not looking for a big breath here, just a regular pace. It's a great way to do it also laying down, like when you're watching a show or before bedtime, just before you go to sleep. Just laying down when the body is completely relaxed and just observe what happens when you take a breath in. What happens when the air goes out? Any idea? What are you noticing?
For me, when I inhale, the belly expands a little bit, and when I exhale, it contracts a little bit.
Correct. And that's what you want to look for. And it seems so simple, but is so important. Very often when I have people go through that exercise, they're like, I have no idea what's happening in my body. So it starts with awareness. As you inhale, the diaphragm contracts, the lungs fill with air, the organs push out a little bit, which is why you feel the expansion. And then also important is that we're not holding the breath, but then slowly letting the air go out again. And then also, when you just were breathing, it was beautiful because your shoulders were relaxed. Because the other thing you want to look for, that it's not, see what I'm doing? For one, I'm breathing through my mouth, just doing that, dried out my mouth. So it was loud breathing, right? We want to have quiet breathing. We want the shoulders to be relaxed. And again, breathing through the nose when you can. Obviously, if you have nasal congestion, that's a different story. But just breathing through the nose helps with connecting to the abdominal breath. So just observing the abdominal breathing it starts with awareness.
It's fascinating to me. There's definitely so much overlap because
so much overlap. Yep.
And really it comes from being relaxed. And, especially you talked about performers. So even if you're performing, there is always a little bit of that sympathetic mode turned on because we are focusing and performing, but being in that relaxed state that will open up your vision. So basically anything that you do, like the palming, the blinking, the breathing, the posture, right? The more we breathe into the chest, the more this gets contracted. This all affects our lymph drainage, our breathing. All of the stuff that you were talking about is both good for your vision and your voice.
Oh, yes. Or the myofascial release that you're doing with the ball, for example, relaxing the neck muscles. Yes, so helpful.
So that I have just a couple, we have to come to a close here on YouTube. And so I just want to address one question. What about having the tonsils and adenoids removed? And I had that done when I was 6 years old. And I remember the best part was I got to eat a lot of
ice cream.
But yeah, so tell us, I think it was very common when I was born in the 60s, like it was very common. And I don't know what the state of the affairs is nowadays, but how does that affect our vision and how?
In terms of so the main goal is oxygen supply to the brain. So in terms of the size of tonsils and adenoids, what causes it? Is it from allergic reactions? It's really about finding out, how long does it occur? For how often does it occur? And then again, for me, I'm not somebody to say, oh, you got to have surgery. Because also just with nasal breathing, for example, you can reduce inflammation in the throat as you make that a new habit. And so it really depends, I've worked with a kid once. He came in wheezing like this. It turns out he had an 85% airway obstruction. Did he need to have And this kid couldn't talk and he just had high anxiety and, he was tongue-tied. It turns out, in his case, he actually needed to have a release. And in his case, the tonsils had to be removed because he could barely breathe. He didn't want to eat because it's an apneic event. Of course, he doesn't want to eat. So, and it's not something he would just grow out of. And so he had, the tonsils removed. And then fast forward half a year, the kiddo is talking, eating, happy as a clam. So it varies from case to case.
So I have a question that popped up just in my head. So a popular thing nowadays is to tape our mouth when we are sleeping. So we haven't really talked about sleep yet, but do you think that's a good idea? Like, are there any tips that you recommend before going to bed? Because really quickly to kind of talk about why I'm asking this, because people always say, why would I palm my eyes? I'm sleeping 8 hours. My eyes are closed for 8 hours. But I always say you might also be straining a lot. You might be straining in your eyes, especially if your eyes feel like kind of stuck in the morning or kind of gritty or not. So is there a similar thing with the voice? Is it good to tape the mouth? What do you recommend for nighttime?
So taping the mouth is more for people that have habitually a way of breathing through the mouth. Now, what causes that? Again, maybe it's a tongue thrust, maybe it's enlarged tonsils or adenoids, maybe it's allergies. Can you retrain the body? So yes, taping at night, because again, you enhance nasal breathing. Also nasal breathing, there's evidence that it reduces sleep apnea and just overall quality of life and improves that. With taping though, you don't want to just go, I'm going to tape my mouth at night. First, try it out daytime. Is your body even able to breathe through the nose comfortably? Because you don't want to put yourself in a state of anxiety. The goal with using a tape, because it provides sensory feedback. Instead of thinking like I'm going to keep the lips together even in daytime, some sensory input is very helpful with that. So start it out if that's something you want to do. Try it out in the daytime, put it on for 5-10 minutes. If you're comfortable, increase it to half an hour, then an hour, and then try it at nighttime and see how that works. And when I talk open mouth breathing, I'm not talking about sleeping like this where the mouth is gaping wide open, but just even if the lips are slightly apart, again, just the goal is to have the lips closed. And again, if the tongue is resting on the roof of the mouth, that in itself is closing the mouth because the air is going through the nose then, because now the tongue is the seal and not the lips.
Okay, and what about snoring? Okay, we can go on for hours.
Oh, we can.
So snoring, is that also a sign of having some kind of
obstruction? Yes, correct. Again, with tongue position, that plays a role with that. Nasal breathing, yes. And there's whole other things that can contribute to snoring. But again, snoring, we want to look at that because it can be a major health risk. And again, sleep is so important, not just that we get enough hours, but that we get the quality of sleep. And that's what's really important.
Wow, what a great discussion. So there's one question that ties into what I'm going to ask you, how people can find you. But Sun Moon wanted to know if you're also a singing coach.
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay.
I work with, go ahead.
So you work with people, you work with people one-on-one, on speech pathologies, on singing, improving the voice. So you kind of have a wide range what you help people with in one-on-one. And how else can they work with you?
Correct. They can work with me one-on-one. It doesn't have, they need to have a pathology. No, they can just say like, hey, you know what? I want to improve my singing voice, or I want to improve my speaking voice. I want to have a better presence. Or if they have a voice problem, okay, then we'll look at that. Yeah. So we can work one-on-one. I also have an online voice program. It's called the Voice Transformation Course. And that basically has the modules include a lot of the things that we talked about today. It tells you how to identify a problem, eliminate triggers, build a foundation for your voice, and how to maintain stamina with that. And that's an online program, and it also has the option of group coaching, life coaching with that as well.
Awesome. We have all the links on YouTube, by the way. They're under the video. So if you watch this later, all the things are listed under the videos. You just have to kind of click read more, and then you see all the links to get Christina's online program. And then the final thing I want to ask, what are the top 3 tips you could give everybody here today?
Okay. Hydration, as we talked about. Hydrate with water, please. Okay, not with coffee. Rest your voice as needed. Avoid throat clearing.
Okay. And I
Start
think you have
there and see how that goes. Yes.
And I think you have a free download again that is all linked underneath the video where people can get additional tips.
Yes, it's 5 easy ways to take care of your voice, and it goes a lot more into detail about those tips. Exactly.
Awesome. And where else can people find you? Are you on Instagram or where else?
I'm on Instagram at Empowered Voice Coach. At Empowered Voice Coach. That's on Instagram. And then you can find me on my website, which is speechandvoiceworks.com.
Speechandvoiceworks.com. Awesome. Well, this was very, very interesting, Christine. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
I definitely want to work with you and improve my own voice, my speaking skills. Thank you so much. So everybody, goodbye YouTube. We will have a little bit of extra time in my Clear Vision Club community. So